Hi, I'm Edie Campbell. I just did a talk with Tim Blanks for the new issue of Love in Dover Street Market, discussing the problems of abuse within the fashion industry and how we got to where we are and where we go from here.
The reason why we're here began with an open letter you wrote to the fashion industry that was published in Women's Wear Daily in the wake of the Weinstein scandal. I'm curious to know what the trigger was for you with this letter.
Well, I think for me it was that post-Weinstein, I kind of looked around and thought, okay, this will happen across the world and it will kind of spread. This thing of checking received behaviours and checking kind of accepted behaviour and what we see as the idiosyncrasies of the industries that we work in. So I thought this will happen within fashion. And it sort of did, except that everyone just looked around and went, oh, well, it's Terry, it's all Terry. And I was kind of like, well, it's not all Terry, because we all know it's not. That whole thing paired up with Cameron Russell's posting on Instagram of the many, many, many stories she received about models who had kind of suffered sexual abuse or harassment or assault at work. And yet still everyone was like, well, it's just Terry. But we all knew that, you know, these hundreds of stories weren't about one person. So I think that was the thing that I just sort of thought, someone's got to say what everyone's thinking, because this is otherwise a cop-out. When you go on set and when you start to model, the bargain is that you walk on set and you do what people want. That's kind of your job. And your body belongs to them, everything belongs to them, the people you're working with. And that's what you're getting paid for. So at what point do you say, no, this is too much? And when you have no real understanding of what is normal in a professional environment, partly because no model is ever given any kind of training before they go to their first job, it's impossible to build that divide between this is me being professional and this is me walking on set, what do you want me to do? I don't know what to do, I'll do anything. So that's a very hard division to make.
Because there's also this thing, there's this sort of pressure to be cool, in a way, to just seem like, oh yeah, I can handle this. You know, everybody else seems to be handling it. I don't want to be the dog.
It's impossible for a 17-year-old to say, I'm not comfortable with that, because that means I'm not comfortable with fashion, I don't want to do this anymore. So really the onus is on the person who's asking them to do things that are unacceptable, not to ask. It's not on the onus of it's not on the 17-year-old to voice something. I mean, everybody who's on set is complicit in allowing these things to happen in front of them. So it comes down to everyone. It's not the buck can't be passed endlessly around the room.
And from your experience, why has this situation evolved and why has it been allowed to prevail?
Because fashion is closed, because the nature of fashion as a fantasy means it has to be closed off, because if you see the inner workings, you don't buy the fantasy. Because we have this thing of the artist genius, and these people who are the only people in the world who could do what they do so well are protected by the people who adore them. And in order to buy into the fantasy of fashion, even from within the industry, you have to sign up to that adoration.
You must have been in a position where you saw people where you could actually, I imagine you could cope, and you must have seen people who couldn't cope.
Yeah, and that's the point of saying the things that I've been saying over the past 6 months, is that it's not for me, I can cope. And I'm lucky that when I feel like I can't cope, I can walk away and take a few months off and check out. But the reasons that I'm saying these things and the reasons that I'm trying to encourage people not to allow these all this kind of like horrible stuff to happen in front of them without saying anything is for the people who can't cope.
You're in a very sexualized environment to begin with, and I think that must be, this is a huge issue, because how do you normalize something which is sexualized in its absolute DNA.
A model's job is to be as desirable as possible. They're doing it to get the good picture. They're being desirable for the picture, not for the person behind the camera. And I think the problem that arises when the person behind the camera, or whoever else it may be, misreads or willfully misreads that situation and inserts themselves into the picture when they weren't ever invited into the picture.
If you look at the history of human creativity, there you can pick out people, Hitchcock in movies or Dali in art or whatever, people who stepped in front of their tools and inserted themselves into the fantasy because the fantasy was their fantasy. Then we come to this issue of the artist's genius, that people bow down in front of the vision.
There's plenty of photographers who are taking great pictures without assaulting the models. And I think it's a kind of willful power trip to think that your creativity only responds to inserting yourself into the picture, that without you, the picture is nothing. I think the argument that having certain parameters on set will limit people's creativity just doesn't stand up to any kind of scrutiny at all.
This situation has existed for decades, essentially. I have stories going back 50 years that are quite shocking, and then the stories. So this issue of complicity becomes very terrifying for everybody because it doesn't stop. You throw a stone in the pond and the ripples just go on and on and on and on forever, and everybody's dirty at the end of it all.
The photographers who have been called out on their behaviours, they are of an older generation. I think there is much less extreme behaviour in the younger generations. That doesn't mean that the same behaviour doesn't happen on a lesser level. I've got plenty of friends who have been cancelled off shoots because they won't sleep with a photographer.
And this applies as much to men as to women, doesn't it?
I think just because these are kind of monumental examples of kind of machismo, they're still 17-year-old boys who don't speak English and are being told what to do by somebody much older, much more successful, who has the ability to transform their lives. To say that you should just walk away just isn't a possibility. And that's photographers in their 30s.
But that's the beginning of the situation that we're seeing with the older generation. Yeah. And then people say this will be a golden age for female photographers.
Yeah, probably will. It really probably will. A lot of people sent me stories, and that was really where sort of I had to kind of commit myself, because these stories were so horrific and so violent on a kind of human level that at that point it was kind of like, well, these are now things that you can't walk away from.
How could you see fashion when things that are fundamental, like desire and fantasy, have been polluted by what we are finding out?
There are 100 photographers and stylists and art directors and designers and everyone else who's involved whose fantasies are kind of pure, and I think again that comes back to why the idea that not being able to assault people will limit your creativity, because it just doesn't stand up to the millions of photographers who have created incredible pictures without ever overstepping a mark.
In a way, you see it in design studios and things. The artist genius notion saturates every bit of fashion, and there's this sort of the notion of exploitation prevails through the whole pyramid, the whole shaky pyramid. I actually think it needs a revolution, just like just about everything else in the world does at the moment.
Because fashion is a club and it's a kind of school trip and everybody's involved, you become too close to the people you work with. They're not your colleagues, they're your friends, but they're not really real friends. No one's expecting perfection, but an attempt would be good. These people are my friends as well, but you know, I get told these stories and I can't go to work with them anymore because I'm in a moral bind not to accept the large check that's being dangled in front of me and to walk away from it. And that's what you do. Surely.
Yes.
I mean, if you're told these stories, which everybody knew and everybody was told, how can you pretend that there isn't a problem? Or that this isn't a problem, it's actually okay, I'm going to sanction it. Yeah, I've once been alone in a room with a photographer, and it did feel very strange, and at that moment I realised I'd never been alone with a photographer, in a room with a photographer. It is strange, it's a very intimate thing you're doing when you're taking a picture of someone. That isn't kind of intimate interaction, and in order to break that intimacy, you kind of need somebody else there. It's too much. It's too intense and it's too intimate otherwise. So I mean, I think it's very sensible to not have ever been alone in a room with a model, not because all models are ravishing and, you know.
Ending on a high note, your reasons for optimism, your faith in humanity, your
reasons for optimism. Hopefully, a young generation of people who are a bit better behaved, a bit less susceptible to the fantasy of fashion in a bad way. People want change. I think people are happy. People have kind of like soldiered on in a kind of not a very pleasant working environment for quite a long time, and I think there's optimism and hope for something that actually is realistically probably more conducive to creative output, because it's not based on fear.
and Cameron, Russell, Adwa, Aboa, and you. What I see as hopeful there is engaging with the real world outside fashion and actually what the situation is inside, and that throws a spotlight as bright as that one on what's been happening. Done. Thank you, Edie. Thank you very much.